Well, Craig Welch is a senior staff writer focused on the environment for National Geographic and National Geographic magazine. He's kind enough to join me on the Climate Pod. Craig, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you for having me.
It's so good to talk to you. And, this is an issue for so many people who are concerned about climate change. When it comes to transportation, the question is, how quickly can we electrify? And I think, we think about electric vehicles. We think about, well, is this just something, especially here in the United States, but of course, this is a global issue as well. Is this something that people of certain means can afford? If we're looking at the way the electric vehicle market is just here in the United States, looking at it in 2021, how do you see the electric vehicle market changing? How do you anticipate, the market share being in the coming years?
Well, it's changing very, very quickly. I think at the outset, a decade or so ago, it really was a market just for the wealthy. I think that is often the way new technologies come in. They come in at sort of the higher price point, because that's the way the people who are sort of starting these industries need to build their products in order to make money. But, what started out with a single Tesla Roadster is now, we have something in the order of 200 different models coming to the of electric vehicles coming to the American market sometime in the next 4 or 5 years. And they range in price point from $100,000 plus to cars in the mid 20s, and the prices are going down. There was a couple of studies, one by Bloomberg and one by another company, that both came to the same conclusion, that the prices for electric vehicles in North America will be on par with the prices for gasoline vehicles within the next 5 years. So it's changing very quickly. And I think most of the people listening to this podcast who have a car and want a car, their next car will almost certainly be electric.
That's super. It's great to hear because as you mentioned, I think a lot of people listen to this podcast, and I know myself, I don't have an electric car. I'd love to have one, but it's like you said, price parity is going to be so important. And like I mentioned in the piece, you're not just exploring the United States. You're talking about market trends all across the globe. Where are you seeing the adoption of electric cars take off the quickest? Forgive the pun. And which countries do you see that happening?
Well, the absolute quickest is Norway. Norway already has half of its cars are electric. That's done in part by some government mandates and a lot of incentives. China is moving very quickly. China has vehicles now that are electric that you can buy for $6,000. They're building small, cheap electric cars, and they're also building sort of the more expensive cars for the wealthier people. And China, this came about in part because they had such air pollution problems, and they were trying to figure out a way to solve a problem other than climate change in order to get cleaner vehicles. And now that industry is taking off. Tesla sells a bunch of its vehicles in China. The markets that are going to be harder are the developing world markets, where you have a lot of the vehicles in places like Africa and Southeast Asia are used vehicles that come from the more developed world. And that is a much trickier problem to solve. They are industries are less inclined, the big corporates are less inclined to start building vehicles there. And so the vehicles that are there are older, they're dirtier, and they stick around longer. And a lot of people in those markets also rely on sort of two-stroke engines from motorcycles. And those also are, you can get a lot farther on them, but the engines themselves are not clean. So the transition taking place on the more developed world is going to be a little bit different when it comes to places like Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia.
Well, you mentioned government incentives in Norway. Are there some key factors that you see when you see these kind of trends in countries where electric vehicles are being adopted more aggressively?
It is absolutely government incentive. I mean, it's one of the arguments that is taking place really in the background right now with the reconciliation bill. I've talked to people from sort of environmentally minded organizations. I've talked to people for this story who are just data analysts, and I talked to people from industry. And to a person, they all said the same thing. This transition to cleaner vehicles is happening whether government is going to be involved or not. but it's not going to happen anywhere near fast enough without government incentives. And that means, encouraging consumers to buy the cars, help with research and development so that battery charging and battery development becomes more consumer friendly. Not everybody is prepared to buy a car where they have to wait 40 minutes to charge a battery, and where you can have better access to charging facilities. If you live in an apartment, how are you supposed to charge your car at night when you don't have a something you can plug into right outside your garage? So without government getting involved and helping on those fronts, this transition is just simply not going to happen at the pace we need it to prevent some of the worst of climate change.
I'm certainly not a market analyst, so I don't understand what's been happening with car sales over the last couple of years. But since the pandemic hit, you certainly hear news about the auto industry. Did the pandemic impact EV sales in any particular way?
That is a really interesting question. And I don't know the answer to whether or not the pandemic itself played a role. But I will say that the time period during the course of the pandemic is when we saw an absolute shift. For the first time in 2020, gas powered vehicle sales collapsed. They dropped something in the order of 16 or 20%. EV sales increased by 35 or 40% at the same time. So that's a dramatic moving in opposite directions. Now, the numbers, of course, are much smaller. I mean, EVs are still in the US, they're 2 to 4% of vehicle sales, and around the world, it's like 12%. But they're increasing. The growth is exponential. So it's hard to say whether or not the pandemic itself made that change, but it certainly, while we were preoccupied with the pandemic and everything happening there, this transition was happening underneath everything, and it was happening even faster than we may have realized.
On this show, we've been talking so much about COP26, a big UN climate change conference at the end of the year, thinking about what kind of rules are going to be proposed and what different countries are going to agree to and actually can make a pact on when it comes to fighting climate change globally. But obviously, in order to hit those global goals, you have to have domestic policy. And one of the things I've really been focused on, especially here in the United States, are how are you going to see bans basically on internal combustion engines, and when might those take place? When you were doing research, were you able to find instances around the world where people are actually starting to have goals to ban the sale of internal combustion engines cars?
Yes, and quite a few actually. Japan, China, the UK, California. They're all in sort of different degrees, but some starting as early as 2030, some as late as 2040. Some are already putting in policies where they plan to have an outright ban on the sale of ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles. Some places like California, it's more of a goal. They don't have any actual concrete thing that says, we're going to be done selling cars, but as goes California, so goes the rest of the United States eventually on most things involving technology. So that's a good sign. The United States as a whole is probably not going to move in that way, because that's not the way, as I'm sure your listeners know, that's not the way our federal government works. But those are going to help drive this kind of transition. That's also, I mean, the writing has been on the wall for a couple of years now, and so the auto industry itself knows. One of the first things Biden did when he took office, already just this summer, was to increase CAFE standards back to where they were under Obama, with plans to keep ratcheting them up. So that would be, requiring the automakers to have much more stringent gas mileage requirements over sort of across the fleets. He's also talking about trying to find a way to get all of the fleet cars for the U.S. government to, what the Forest Service drives, or the cars at the Park Service, or other fleet vehicles, to be electric vehicles. All of those things are sending market signals to the Volkswagens and the Fords and the GMs of the world. In addition to all of that, you also have this sort of PR phenomenon, that the popularity of doing something about climate change, given what we've seen in the last couple of years. I live in Seattle. We've had the most dramatic heat wave in our lifetimes in the last couple of years. I've been here 23 years. Only in the last 5 have I had to worry about smoke in August and September from wildfires. All of those things are pushing consumers to make clear that they want to see companies make these transitions. So, Ford and GM and Volkswagen, all these big names are all making promises themselves that they're going to be moving away from ICE vehicles. Again, the commitments are often fuzzy. It's not like we're saying by 2035 we will stop making the last of these, because they want to have an out in case that market collapses, because they still have shareholders to answer to. But all these transitions are taking place right now, and that is driving a lot of market signals, and it's being done with or without the Biden administration. But the Biden administration is making the regulatory changes it can to sort of try and push it in that direction.
You profile, well, a great deal of the piece talks a lot about Volkswagen, and Volkswagen is this very interesting. I don't know if interesting is the right word. Very
Mm-hmm.
interesting company, because they obviously, as you mentioned in the piece, they cheated on emissions rules for years. It is a huge scandal. We've talked about it on the show several times, and now they have pivoted in a sense, and they are really attacking electric vehicles. I'm curious, what made you want to look into what Volkswagen was doing?
Well, I mean, I thought Volkswagen was an interesting choice because they were at one point and recently the world's largest manufacturing company, and not just vehicle manufacturing, but manufacturing at all. And then in the last couple of years, we've seen them commit to making, I think they said they were going to invest $70 billion in, or no, excuse me, it's $40 billion of US dollars in making electric vehicles. And they're doing some dozens and dozens of new, that's what it was, 70 models of cars over the course of the next 10 years that will all be electric. And given where they came from, and the sort of the emission scandal, it wasn't clear to me whether, is this a change of heart or is this greenwashing? And how do you know the difference? And so I wanted to sort of explore what they're doing. And I think, Volkswagen is not saying we will not make any more ICE vehicles. But I talked to an organization called the International Council for Clean Transportation. And it's a group of analysts who basically sort of supply governments with data on how to make the transition to cleaner energy. They were the ones who first spotted the emissions scandal and the mistakes that, well, not the mistakes, excuse me, the cover up that Volkswagen was doing with its diesel emissions. And the analysts for that organization say what Volkswagen is doing now is far and above anything that was expected and required of them from the sort of legal fallout from their emission scandal. And it is far and above what all of the other major auto manufacturers are doing. So I thought that was very interesting, and it's a chance to sort of look and see what decision making is like for these organizations. I mean, they're answering to shareholders. Even if they want to do the right thing, it's not as simple as just like we're gonna do this, because they have to build a market. So they're trying to figure out a way to be a leader in the electric vehicle market without collapsing their share value, and it's a complicated task. I got a chance to interview the CEO of Volkswagen North America twice, and he comes from a marketing background, so he's a good talker, but he's very plain spoken, and he said, you know, the emissions scandal is a stain on our reputation and one we're going to have to live with for a very long time. And he came into Volkswagen, well after all of this happened. So he was with a different company. He was with Audi, and he said, our leadership basically said, how can we take a different tack and still have and make a profit? So they're going all in way more so than all the other auto manufacturers, and it was sort of interesting to watch and see how they're making those decisions and what their concerns are.
Well, it's fascinating in the piece. You not only talk about the trends and how companies and countries are responding, but you actually talk about the way these cars are manufactured. I've never seen any vehicle manufactured, let alone an electric one. I'm curious, watching these vehicles be manufactured, what stood out to you?
Well, I agree. I had never been to see, and I have like apparently a 1960s image in my head of what a manufacturing line would look like, and I did not realize for example, how automated it is already. And the cars go by a station and they get lifted up, and there are people on little wheelchairs. I mean, they're literally on like sort of a wheel around office chair, and they will be with a, a like a power gun where they're trying to like shoot bolts into the undercarriage of the car, and they do that for like 30 seconds at a time. It's really fascinating. And the other thing I was surprised by is that they like, I would assume that you have like one line for a Passat and one line for a, a Jetta, and they just put all of the cars on there, and they have like automatic sensors that figure out which vehicle it is and sort of which part of the line it should go on, and what comes next. And then the other thing is that it's also weirdly sort of a throwback when something goes wrong. This is a huge manufacturing. It was I can't remember, 3 million square feet, something like that, just a massive building. When something goes wrong in a particular portion of the line, they will start playing a jingle, and you will hear like an old, I can't remember, it's like the entertainer from the Sting, and like a little like being played by bells and whistles, and that's a signal that, oh, when that happens, we know that that means that there's a problem on the battery line or on the the car, the wheel line or something. It's all really fascinating. And so what Volkswagen is going to do with electric vehicles is they're going to have ICE vehicles and electric vehicles be built on the same line, and then there will be a separate line where they will bring in batteries that they're putting together from next door. And then eventually, when it comes to like the seats and the electronics and the body, all that stuff will be done as if it were any other car.
You write in the piece that all electric vehicles are simpler than powered ones. How so?
I mean, if you think about what is in what's in a gas car. I mean, if you open up the engine and you just look, and there's all of this piping, and like, I don't know what most of it does. You know, all of that is gone. I mean, basically, a battery will weigh, it's a collection of batteries, actually, a collection of cells. It will weigh 1,000 to 1,300 pounds, and for the most part, they run the length of the undercarriage of a vehicle. And so you have all that weight at the bottom, and then all the stuff where the engine used to be is gone. I mean, there are no pistons, there are no pipes, there's no oil. Like, all that stuff just doesn't exist anymore. And so it gives you more space. It gives you, it changes everything. And so it's a much different type of vehicle to manufacture. It's easier for them to manufacture. The hard part for an electric vehicle is getting the materials for a battery, and that's I'm sure you probably talked about that at some point on your podcast, because that itself is a whole new world that's developing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big part of the clean energy economy overall, is understanding what happens in supply chains and making sure that there's frankly not horrible human rights abuses happening in those supply chains. That's a concern for so much in the clean energy economy. And yeah, I'm curious, when you think about the way these raw materials are being sourced, what are countries going to have to focus on to ensure that the supply chains work in a way that's humane?
That is a very good question, and it's a very complicated one that nobody has a clear answer to. In parts of Africa where we get cobalt, which are used in batteries, I mean, they've had, years and years of child labor problems where, like, you have, very young children working in these mines. You have, lithium mining can be terrible for the environment if not done properly. Um, the only good news is that the point of this transition is to help the environment, and the people selling the vehicles are aware that that's what their consumers are expecting. So, the Volkswagens of the world, it's not in their interest to have child labor, because if they get caught doing something like that after having gone through an emissions scandal, nobody's going to buy a Volkswagen ever again. And so the companies themselves, governments like the European Union, are trying to figure out some system where they can have, basically, third-party audits to
Hmm.
make sure that the sourcing for material is both environmentally and human rights appropriate. How well that works, that remains to be seen. But it is an essential ingredient for our future. So we have to find a way to do that.
Well, yeah, and again, it goes to it's another example about how fighting climate change is truly a global problem, and really requires global cooperation to ensure any kind of success. I'm thinking about, when it comes to batteries, not only do we have supply chain concerns, but also we want to see batteries get cheaper and be able to charge more for longer duration drives, and then also have the infrastructure in place so that charging is easier, like you mentioned earlier in the conversation. When it comes to how batteries are developing, what do you see as some of the big shifts happening now?
I mean, so batteries are getting cheaper. They're getting cheaper quickly. I mean, I think the cost of a battery has dropped 89% in the last 20 years. I mean, it's insanely cheap compared to what it used to be, and that I don't think anybody thinks we've hit the floor yet. So I think those prices are going to continue to drop. There are all sorts of organizations out there, tech companies out there with claims that they have a battery that can charge 250 miles in 10 minutes. I've seen at least three different organizations that can make a claim like that. Now, whether or not that is true and it can be sold to consumers and manufactured, we don't know yet. But I think, just as, solar prices dropped very quickly and wind power dropped, I think you're going to see that kind of technological innovation happen. At the same time, there's also a push to make sure that, as you mentioned, supply chains, that you have, where our mines are located, are where the markets need to be, so that you're not basically, taking something out of the ground in Nevada, shipping it to Asia for processing, shipping it to Europe for manufacturing, and then sending that vehicle to Tennessee for a consumer. Finding some way to get those processes so that they consume less energy in the supply chain itself. That is something that is being thought about industry wide right now, trying to figure out how to make sure people have not just battery sourcing, but the battery sourcing is not requiring 3 trips across the country to burn fossil fuels to get it to where they need it.
I was really struck in the piece when you talk about how electric vehicles are originally pushed out of the market, because we had this point where it was not clear that a fossil fuel transportation was going to be the way to go. What initially kind of pushed electric vehicles out of the market?
Well, it's yeah. I have been sort of fascinated by electric vehicles for a while. A photographer and I, for a previous story, actually took a cross country trip in electric vehicles, and we went from Santa Monica to DC, and along the way tried to hit as many sort of energy transition points as we could. We stopped in, at a wind farm in Texas where they were using wind to power, to oil development, and going up to places where we were seeing solar take over. And we stopped by the closure of the coal plant on the Navajo reservation. But during that trip, I came across, just doing some background work, I came across some of the older development of vehicles, and some of the first vehicles sold in the United States were electric. And Ferdinand Porsche in Vienna wanted to build electric vehicles because he thought Europe had air that was too dirty already. So people were already thinking about the cost. But what happened was the same problem we have now. There were concerns about whether or not a battery could get you on a long distance trip, and oil prices at that time, we found oil in Texas. Oil was suddenly, it just got really cheap. And so cheap oil and the development of an a national road network, people decided they didn't want to have cars that just drove to work or to the market or around town. They wanted to go from California to Ohio. And in order to do that, they needed gas because they didn't have batteries and electricity that could get them there.
It's so fascinating because you look back in history and you think about people spotting pollution at the time, recognizing that that was a problem. I mean, in the last just few years alone, but if you think about it in the last decade, the amount of research that has come out on air pollution to help us understand how deadly, how dangerous, how costly it is. And you think about what you said earlier in the conversation about government incentives being key to help, basically accelerate this transition to electric vehicles. If you just do the math on air pollution, my goodness, that pays for the entire clean energy economy transition itself. But I'm curious, you think when people are looking at electric vehicles, understanding what is being lost due to air pollution, especially now that we've gone through a respiratory pandemic, a respiratory disease pandemic, how do you anticipate the politics of electric vehicles kind of changing over the next few years?
I mean, I think there's sort of two different things. There are the sort of politics in the Washington, D.C. sense and the politics among consumers. Because I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I didn't mention this in the piece because it's something that slipped my mind. But even if we had no government incentives and we made this transition slowly, we are quickly cleaning the air from not burning the oil in our gas anymore. I mean, that by itself is something that we're improving on. We're saving lives. I mean, it's all good. If we want to speed this transition, it's even better. You're saving lives. You're reducing noise pollution. I mean, the electric vehicles are virtually silent. So, all those highways you drive on where you see these giant brick walls or concrete walls to try and protect homes from around there from the just incredible traffic noise, all of that won't be so necessary anymore. So, on the consumer side, I think people are going to start to recognize that these vehicles ultimately are better in a lot of ways we don't even think about. On the Washington, D.C. side, I think we still have the same sort of political stalemate we've had for a long time. Um, I think there are people in the Republican caucus who probably are very supportive of electric vehicles. There's a lot done for electric vehicles in the bipartisan infrastructure package, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of pressure on them right now, that even though experts even from industry say that we need more government help and more incentives to make this transition fast enough, that does not seem to be enough to change the politics in DC. And I don't know whether that will happen in the near future or not.
Yeah, you've been covering this for a while. As we think about the next few years, what are you going to be excited to watch develop when it comes to electric vehicles?
I mean, I don't own an electric vehicle. I would like one. I do not make a lot of money. I would like to have something that I can afford. And I like the idea of having vehicles that are small. Um, the other thing that we have to keep in mind is like this. I don't. Our cities are getting more compact. I live in Seattle. I live in what used to be called a single family home neighborhood, but we are seeing lots of multifamily housing sort of come in and make it more dense, which I think is excellent. I think that's what has to happen in cities like this. Um, our public transportation in Seattle is not great, but it's getting better. So I think the idea for electric vehicles is you want to have them when you need to do something like leaving town, not go to the grocery store. It'd be nice to have alternatives to cars for going to the grocery store. And I think those alternatives are coming. There was a great piece in the New York Times this weekend about sort of transit and mass transit and all the creative electrification of mass transit we're seeing around the world. I think all of that together is really what's going to make a difference. I also think the other thing we haven't talked about that I think is important is we're seeing delivery service becoming electrified. So between Amazon and Federal Express and UPS, all of these services that deliver goods to your door, and they do so far more than we did 15 years ago. Those vehicles are becoming electric. So, the trip that you and I might have taken to go buy an extra bag of groceries that we would have spent gas on is going to come to our door delivered, because we get a lot of things delivered now in a vehicle that is charged by electricity. So I think we're going to see a lot of benefits that are sort of ancillary to our own driving.
Yeah, I know in the coming years, people are going to want to follow this as well. For people who are wanting to follow your work online, where can they go to find more of your work?
You can go to nationalgeographic.com. And you could also, my Twitter handle is just Craig A. Welch. And, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I feel like the last couple of years we're seeing a lot of progress, and it's actually the most, while the what's happening in the world is not always great, what's happening on this front is actually very hopeful.
Well, it's a great piece. We will make sure to link to it in our show notes. Craig Welch, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you.